All right, so here's my introduction again. Good morning, I'm Karen Clark with Citywide Training and Development. We are part of the City of Columbus, and again, we are happy to partner with you in your DE&I series. And today's topic is why it's so hard to talk about bias and how unconscious bias affects work. And just as a review, since we've been doing this series, I'm sure you all already know this definition, but I always like to start with the definition again. Implicit bias, also known as unconscious bias, implicit social cognition, which also includes implicit associations referring to attitude stereotypes. My favorite line of the definition: can be favorable, i.e. preferences, or unfavorable assessments. But because they are unconscious or subconscious, they're activated involuntarily. So since our topic today is talking, how do we talk about it? I'd like to ask you all, how comfortable are you with having conversations about bias? And here I have just a brief list of different types of bias. Some you may not be immediately familiar with, for instance, is attribution bias, which is a cognitive bias that refers to systemic errors made when people try to evaluate other behaviors or their own behaviors. So an example of that is, well, boys will be boys. So instead of saying, they should be responsible for what they're doing, it's kind of written off like, oh, well, that's just how they act. Of course, there's also confirmation bias, which is a tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information in a way that confirms and supports one's beliefs already. So if you have a belief, and if you're only looking at information, be it media or print material, that only confirms that, you're not getting a holistic view about that. The halo effect, we often hear about the halo and the horns effect, which is a type of cognitive bias in which our overall impression of a person influences how we feel and think about their character. So just as a review on that. So again, how comfortable are you having conversations about bias? If you could put in the chat for me, those of you who are on here already, A, very comfortable. B, comfortable. C, it depends on the type of bias. D, uncomfortable. Or E, very uncomfortable. And while you're putting your responses in the chat, I need to go back because I don't think I put in that I'm going to be using videos here. So I want to make sure I share sound. There we go. Okay. So I have some answers here. C, okay, it depends on the type of bias. B, comfortable. So of those of you who are on with us right now, we have both comfortable and okay, it depends on the type of bias. And I'm glad that people were honest with their responses there. But the great news is we're here to help, at least to help encourage you to have those conversations about bias that can change minds and hearts. So 3 ingredients, there's many more, but just 3 that we really like to focus on has an acronym of REM, not the band. They are pretty good, but not the band. R is respect. E is empathy. And M is maturity. And as we know, these topics can be uncomfortable. So it does take maturity to be able to listen to other people's perspectives, as well as extend empathy, bidirectional empathy, we'll say. While we may not have experienced what someone else may have experienced, perhaps we can think of a situation where we might have had similar feelings about it. I like to explain empathy as emotion matching, because there's no way that Other people are going to have my same experiences and vice versa, but I may have had a different experience that might have elicited a very similar emotion. So the question is, why do you feel it's important to talk about unconscious bias? And reasons to talk about unconscious bias, I'm just going to review 3 reasons today. Number 1, it raises awareness. And the more we talk about it, the more comfortable that we are to talk about it. So unconscious bias is unconscious. People don't notice a lot of times until it's actually pointed out. So for instance, you might have noticed that you've made Vanessa, an Asian team member, the de facto expert on all things Asian at your job. Without noticing it, you ask her for advice on clients based in Asia, even though that's not her responsibility. And this also happens, I read an article a couple of months ago about people who are considered minorities in their work groups being asked to be that D&I person when they may not even have any experience in it, but by virtue of the fact that they are minority, somebody, and I'm sure not purposefully, thinks that, hey, that's the person that we need to have leading this information. So if you bring it up with your friends on the team, say at lunch, and other people are unaware that they may have the same assumptions. In a lot of unconscious bias, again, it is unconscious, but we don't think about what we're doing. And in doing that to Vanessa, that kind of, puts her on the spot. When again, 1, it's not her responsibility in the scenario that we just had, but 2, Asia, or people who have descended from Asia, there's a whole diaspora. And that doesn't mean that that person, Vanessa, is familiar with all of it any more than someone would ask me my opinion about what Black people think. Black people aren't a monolithic group any more than Asians are, any more than Hispanics are. So we need to keep that in mind as we're going along. Number 2, it makes people more likely to interrupt bias in the moment. So it brings it into your consciousness. And I know I've spoken about that before. One of the main purposes for us to facilitate these types of conversations is, yes, it's unconscious, but what we'd like to do is bring it more to your consciousness forefront so that it doesn't mean that you're not going to have biases, but even if you do, you may be able to catch yourself and think, oh, wait a minute, why am I thinking about this? For example, because of your conversation, one of your friends might catch herself before asking Vanessa for recommendations about Vietnamese restaurants in town. Vanessa might not even be Vietnamese. She could be Chinese, or she could be Korean, or some other Asian descent. And so with having those conversations, somebody might think, oh, wait a minute, that's not right. I can do research for myself, or even ask the group as a whole about recommendations for Vietnamese food, of which we have some really great restaurants here in town. I did learn, and if anybody knows any better, PHO, because there's a really great restaurant in Clintonville. Well, a lot of people pronounced it Pho 614, but I understand it may be Pho as a pronunciation. So if anybody knows the correct pronunciation, please do let me know.
You're correct, Karen. It's Pho.
Pho. Thank you, Zuline. Thank you. So now I know for sure. So it's not like, I'm not sure in saying that. So thanks for that. But again, delicious food. Number 3, it normalizes talking about it. That's why we're having this session today about how to talk about bias. Again, yeah, it may be a little uncomfortable, but the more we do it, the more we normalize talking about bias, unconscious or even conscious. Um, so there's a cycle in talking about bias. The more you talk about it, the more comfortable you are uh, feeling vulnerable about your biases and comfortable about other people having vulnerabilities about talking about bias. So it's just like any other topics that may be uncomfortable. Again, the more you talk about it, the easier it gets. And it's not just a one day thing, it's a work in progress, or it's like we talk about working documents or living documents. It's a constant, I want to, yes, evolution, if you will, from being, hey, I don't feel comfortable talking about this at all, versus, okay, let's have this conversation. So no one wants to admit to treating people unfairly. I recall when I first started facilitating these courses, and I would ask the question, how many of you have biases? And I'd raise my hand and I'd be the only one. But after we went through the definition of it, people realized, oh, okay, yeah, we all have biases. But the first thing we do as humans, and that's all of us, we don't like to be accused of being judgmental, nor do we like to be accused of having biases. And again, because the word bias, most people automatically revert to thinking it's a bad thing. But the truth is, again, we do all have biases. Bias is a feature of our brain caused by its tendency to categorize. So if you see unconscious bias affecting your work, then might be a good time to have an honest conversation about it. So here we are already at quiz time. So here's the situation. Audrey has noticed that some people on her team, her included, make jokes about people's ages, which her older coworkers may overhear. She thinks she should talk about it, but it's uncomfortable. What's a reason for Audrey to bring it up with someone? So here are our options. A, to get some disciplinary action started for the offending team member. B, to apologize for the ageism that regularly happens on her team. C, to cure her colleagues' unconscious bias. Or D, to raise awareness of the unconscious bias that may be in play. So I'm putting that question to you. If you put please put your answers in the chat. What's a reason for Audrey to bring it up with someone? A, B, C, or D? Okay, so looks like everybody's in agreement on D, to raise awareness of the unconscious bias that may be in play. Now, here's another question that isn't included in our presentation today. How many of you in your work contexts have experienced someone making a joke about age? And this is, again, certainly not judgmental, but how many of you have done it? I know we've done it in our team. Anybody else? Okay, thank you, Teresa. Because Teresa's the only one, right? All right, thank you, David. Chelsea, yes. And here's an example, again, in another session that I facilitated. I know, right? Joe, that's me, self-depreciating jokes about age. But in one of my other sessions, I had a participant pull me aside, and she, interestingly, I never thought about this. She asked me what she should do about her coworkers that called her ma'am. And I didn't understand. She was like, I prefer that they just call me by my first name. And she said, but yet they still keep calling her ma'am. Now, I don't know about you, but growing up, we were always taught to respect those that we perceived as being our elders by saying, yes, ma'am, yes, sir, no, ma'am, no, sir. But she felt, she didn't want to have that label. And I found that to be very interesting. The only advice that I could give her was to continue to remind them to call you however you wish to be called, whether it's your first name. But I even do that with people that might be perceived to be younger than I am. I just consider it an overall greeting of respect. Does anyone else have any experiences about that? Being called ma'am or sir, and you feeling some type of way, as the kids say?
I've
I
actually
don't have any
had,
excuses, but I pretty much agree with you, or not agree with you, identify with you, Karen, because I'll say that to everyone. Yes, sir. No, ma'am. It doesn't matter what their age is. It's just like you said, it's for me and how I grew up, it's a sign of respect. So I would have never thought that someone would have taken it another way.
I know, right? Yeah, I agree. Teresa, I believe you had a response.
I was going to say, I agree that it's a sign of respect, and I do it all the time to people. But when someone says ma'am to me, it makes me feel older. So that's my own personal, I guess, bias of myself to look at that and say, wait a minute, I'm not a ma'am. I'm not old enough to be a ma'am, even though I use it to everybody, regardless of their age. When I respond to somebody, it's yes, ma'am, yes, sir. And, regardless of who they are and what their age is, I don't even think about that. I just think it is as giving them respect. But then when someone does it to me, I'm like, wait a minute, I don't want to be that. So I totally get it. That happens all the time. In fact, at our golf outing, and Chelsea will laugh because the guy was like, yes, ma'am. I'm like, no, my name is Teresa. And he's like, no, you're ma'am. And I'm like, no, my name is Teresa. He would not call me by my name the entire day. So I totally get it.
Yeah, interesting. Joe?
Yep. Same with me. I use it all the time. And I am kind of surprised when someone uses it, especially if they're younger, unless they give me that senior discount, and then I'm good with it, right? No, seriously, it does, like Teresa said, it does kind of surprise me, but then I think, well, that's how I was raised to use that, so it's it doesn't really offend me, but it does surprise me sometimes, because I think our culture is kind of like very casual now. So not everybody has the same kind of upbringing, I guess. I don't know if that's the right word, but anyway.
No, I do think it's the right verbiage there, Joe. And I don't know, David, since Teresa never called you sir, sounds like you all might need to have a conversation about that. But that's interesting. Chelsea, I'm going to put you on the spot. What are your thoughts about it?
I mean, I know there is a little bit of an age gap between me and probably most of us on this call. I guess I don't really, I guess I kind of think of it as, yes, it refers to age. A way that I have noticed like a respect thing is people saying like Miss Miss Chelsea or Miss Teresa. My neighbor is Mr. Bill. And I don't know that I would call someone, I don't know, Teresa, have I ever called you ma'am? I don't think, yeah, I guess I just, it's not a, it's not a word I use in my vocabulary really. Or sir, I think it would, I don't know, not come off as, like not I mean, maybe a little fake or like put on. I don't know. I guess I don't really consider those terms. But the way that I would think about like a respectful way to address someone would be putting like Miss or Mr. in front of their first name rather than just calling them like I refer to Teresa all the time, but my neighbor, Bill, I refer to as Mr. Bill. I don't know him that well. And I don't know that it would be, so I guess it's similar, a similar way to address someone as, Sir or Mr. Bill, just putting like something of respect. I would agree that I wouldn't assume that, there's, the reason that I'm using those terms is because of age. It's more of a respect thing. I just don't really use those terms in my language, I guess.
Okay, thank you for that, Chelsea. It is interesting, and it may even be a generational thing as well. I think Joe alluded to that. But I will say, I'm sorry, I wanted to laugh because you said, no, I don't want to call him Mr. Bill, which I don't remember what show that was from, but some of you, oh, Mr. Bill, no. David, have you had any experiences with being called sir, or do you call other people ma'am or sir?
I do not.
Oh, no. Okay. So
I
now
mean-
we all know we need to call David sir or Mr. David.
I prefer King, but whatever.
Okay. And that's it. So you announce how you want to be addressed, and that's important. So again, a reason for Audrey to bring it up is to raise awareness of a unconscious bias that may be in play. So when she brings up the fact that age bias may be leading to these jokes, some of her team members may have a better chance of interrupting that bias. And again, just about age bias, it's supposed to be illegal, although we know that it still does happen, unfortunately. And there's a lot of intersectionality that goes into that, especially for women, which, do I keep dyeing my hair black or dark brown or whatever it is, so as not to be assumed to be older than I am, or to be assumed to be the age that I am, and have it considered that I might not be able to perform a task because of someone's perceptions. So I have this video here. How does unaddressed bias impact you, your work, and the world? Since we also want to talk about how that applies to us at work.
A lot of the time, our biases are useful. They are basic brain functions that help us assess levels of threat and keep us safe. But sometimes, when we're relating to or evaluating other people, they can cause real harm. Bias subtly prompts us to relate to people differently. We immediately hit it off with some kinds of people, but with others we're more cautious or more aloof. We don't often pause to ask ourselves what might be driving our responses in these situations, and whether it's valid. As a result, we miss out on opportunities to connect, grow, and learn from others. The blind spots created by our particular unconscious biases can impact our work. We can unknowingly play into hurtful biases by doing things like habitually interrupting a teammate or designing a media strategy that is unintentionally offensive to a specific group of people. Plus, because we're all so connected online, our biased choices can spread way more quickly than they would have a few years ago. One unintentional faux pas can get amplified on social media, rebound back onto us, and hurt our companies. The point isn't to be afraid of posting on Twitter, but to take that extra second to think about the ramifications of what you do, to question your certainties. Our choices have a ripple effect. Think about this. When you refer someone you know for a job, you might think that person is the best suited for the role because they have attributes that are similar to you. That's not inherently a bad thing. After all, if you're suited for the job, then it makes sense to think someone similar would be too. But it can become problematic when the majority of the people in your workplace share similar backgrounds. That creates a world where people of certain backgrounds are provided with advantages when it comes to hiring, or promotions, or choosing outside vendors. That means the people outside the majority are put at a disadvantage. They're made to feel like outsiders. We're all built with blind spots, but the work of being our best selves is to be aware of those blind spots and the impact they have on our lives.
So she made a couple of really good points there. She talked about, let me make sure this is,
A lot of
there we go. She talked about the likelihood, and not even just at work, that we are drawn to people like ourselves. That's called affinity bias. After all, we know the word affinity means to like. So if you're not aware or consciously aware that you have that propensity to do that, then again, you end up with everyone looking and being the same. She also talked about blind spot bias, which I have on my reference page at the end, but this is one of my favorite books, Blind Spot, which is Hidden Biases of Good People. And again, I'll have that on the last slide. The authors is Banaji and Greenwald. Greenwald is actually one of the creators of the implicit association test by Harvard University currently. So here are some reflective questions. In what way does, or what ways does unconscious bias affect your decision-making? Do you hang out with people from only one group? Do you listen to people from one group more than people from other groups? Do your behaviors go against your consciously held beliefs? For example, that you should have a diverse group of friends. And how you might be able to do a self-audit is to do, there's an exercise called the 10, not the talented 10, but or 5 people. Just write down the names of 3 to 5 people and then go through some demographic groups. What are their ages? What is their education? What is their ethnicity? And you can add other things. What is their sexual preference? And then look at that to see if they're all like you. And if they are, okay, that's fine. But then that might prompt you to expand your circle so that you have differing opinions. Now, this is but one of many, many studies that are available on the interwebs. This particular one is from 2012 by the University of Pennsylvania, and it was a study where they sent, as you see here, 6,000 emails, same content, different names, different results, where one group was favored more than another group. And what they found was there was a 25% favorable bias towards those emails that the receiver assumed were white males. So for instance, Jose Zamora may have emailed their professor. He didn't necessarily get a response, but if he changed his name to Joe Zamora, he may be more likely to get a response. And these things, again, happen unconsciously. So again, it happens when we make assumptions about someone based on the perceived group that they belong to. And the reason I put that word perceived in, because now the way our global society is, it's not always that easy to tell by someone's name what their ethnicity is. So, you know, Jose or Joe Zamora, here's a good example. I read another article. Yes, I'm a nerd. I do a lot of reading. But there was a family whose last name was Garcia, and the descendants were pretty proud of that. They assumed they were Hispanic. They did Ancestry or 23andMe, only to find out that they didn't have any DNA from any of the Hispanic ethnicities. As it happens, the great-great-grandfather actually changed his name many years before because he was wanted for a crime. And back then, people were able to just change their names and stick to that. And therefore, his whole family of Garcias were in fact not Garcias. They had finally found someone who knew of him from those years ago and told the story as to why he changed his name. And he was able to do that because he was a lighter skinned man. He looked like he could have been Hispanic, but he wasn't. So that's why it's important that I put that word perceived group. And with that, it often leads to stereotypes that we absorb and can lead us sometimes to make unfair decisions against our consciously held beliefs. And as the young lady stated in the video, you know, we're going to have those biases, but again, you want to take a moment before you act on those biases. And I may have shared one of my favorite quotes with you before, but the quote is, and I apologize, I don't know who the author is, but it is that you are not responsible for your first thought, but you are responsible for your second thought and your first action, because that's where the power lies. As you know, our bodies are built for bias. So no one's going to blame you if you see someone or you meet someone and because of media influences or friends or whatever it is, you might have a particular thought about them that may in fact not be true, but give yourself a moment to think. Am I acting within my own unconscious biases or not before you act on them? It can creep in at any time, again, hence the title, unconscious or subconscious. And before we know it, it can happen. If in fact that does happen, because what I don't want us to think is, oh, I've got to really just always be concentrating on whether or not I'm acting within a bias. You don't want to be that person. What you want to do is to, if you engage within a bias, an unfavorable bias, the first thing you should do is apologize. You know, a lot of time it depends on our intent. And hopefully your intent would not be to purposefully harm someone's reputation or anything like that. So if you do it, apologize and ask, you know, what, like I did with the word "fa," ask, I'm sorry, what is maybe the correct way to address this? We need to, not need to, we want to be more open and when we're dealing with other people. So it can affect both, unconscious bias can affect both small and large decisions. For instance, who gets FaceTime with the boss, or who is often in the boss's office having discussions. You also want to take note of who's left out of those discussions, when in fact, you really are not interested in being unfair to anyone, but as leaders, even as peers, it would be good to keep those things in mind so that no one feels left out in discussions or happenings that are going on. Okay, quiz time again. What does it mean to have a blind spot? A, B, C, D. A is not being able to see a full field of vision. B, not being able to see a certain area behind while you're driving. C, not being able to categorize people, places, or things into groups. Or D, not being able to see your unconscious biases affects your judgment and decision making. If you could put your answers in the chat, please. Okay, we have A, not being able to see a full field of vision. D's, okay. And I think that is just about everyone there. and another D, thank you. So yes, technically having a blind spot is not being able to see a full field of vision or not being able to see a certain area behind you while driving. I know I had that hammered into my memory as I was learning to drive. And I do that with my, my son and nieces and nephews as well. Make sure you check your blind spot. But in this particular scenario, it is D. Not being able to see your unconscious biases affect your judgment and decision making. So you might feel that you're being equal to everyone. Here's an example. You don't look like you're gay, which would be unfair to someone who may or may not be gay. But while you think you treat everyone the same, that statement there illuminates that blind spot bias. Again, hidden biases of good people. All right, next question. Your colleague says that unconscious bias is hard on individuals, but doesn't have any cumulative effect on society. What can you say to them? A, when unconscious bias occurs throughout a system, it can be a basis for many of the inequalities we see in our society. B, he's right. We should still do our best to be more inclusive on an individual level. C, unconscious bias actually isn't that hard on individuals. It's only bad, because of its effect on society. And D, unconscious bias has an effect on society, but only individuals can do anything about it. What are your thoughts here? Put your answers in the chat. Okay, A and D. A. Okay, D. All right, so we have between A and D. A is when unconscious bias occurs throughout a system, it can be a basis for many of the inequalities we see in our society. And D, unconscious bias has an effect on society, but only individuals can do anything about it. The answer is A, but I do agree that D also plays a part. I would probably scratch the words "but only." Individuals can definitely make an impact on it, but when we deal with systemic biases, that goes beyond individual actions. It includes individual actions, but it goes beyond them. So thank you for your responses to that. I have two more questions. Your colleague thinks your unconscious biases only affect the people you're biased against. What can you tell them? A, unconscious bias affects people you're biased towards. 2, by giving them unfair advantages. B, unconscious bias only affects some people, but it's still worth examining. C, unconscious bias doesn't affect people, it affects decisions. And D, unconscious bias limits you since it keeps you from having all the options available to you when you make decisions. What do you think? Put that in the chat, please. Okay, great. So we have A and D again. So the answer is A, and then we'll talk about D as well. So your colleague thinks your unconscious biases only affect the people you're biased against. The key word in this question is against. And what can you tell them? Well, A, unconscious bias affects people you're biased towards as well. So I would probably change that to as well, by giving them unfair advantages. Think about who gets the FaceTime with the boss all the time. So that is a favorable bias. Remember that line in the definition, bias can be favorable and unfavorable. So in this scenario, the answer is A, or the question. However, D is also important because unconscious bias limits you since it keeps you from having all the options available to you when you make decisions. Again, that applies because conversely, the people who do not have face time with the boss may be missing out on some information that may be relevant to the decision that needs to be made. So certainly there can be an argument made for both A and D. A is your favorable bias. D is acting on unfavorable bias. And the last question, your colleague has noticed that the same 3 people are always talking in her team meetings. What might be the cause of this? A, those 3 people are the most qualified people on the team and other people defer to them. B, those 3 people are the most senior members of the team, so they deserve more attention. C, those 3 people are being called on more, or their ideas and comments are being validated more. And D, those 3 people are too comfortable speaking up and need to be told to take it down a notch. What do you think? Put it in the chat for me. Okay, Chelsea, A, D, and C. David, C. Teresa, C. All right. And yes, C. Those 3 people are being called on more, or their ideas and comments are being validated more. I've seen this happen in some of the teams I've been on. Actually, I do agree with D. I've been in on some teams where there's just some people, I wonder if they just like to hear themselves talk. So sometimes maybe a one-on-one conversation might be to talk to them about what it is that they're saying. I think, Chelsea, I think you also mentioned, did you mean to put A?
No, that was for my answer for the last. That was my answer for the last question. But I would say that for me, the people who are always talking, I kind of assume, well, if they're speaking up, they're the most qualified. And so I'm going to keep my ideas to myself, especially if their ideas are being validated, then certainly they have, they should be the ones speaking, not me. So I did put C for this question, but I considered A because I would look at someone's, I guess, their background, or someone with a, say Sally has a master's degree and I have a bachelor's degree, and then I'm going to, keep my ideas quiet in front of someone who is, I would assume, more qualified than I am to speak on the subject.
Totally understand. Thank you for that, Chelsea, which may or may not be the actual case. Especially, and actually that's one of the dimensions of diversity on our diversity wheel is education level. My grandfather had a 3rd grade education, but we all learned growing up. That didn't mean he knew less than the rest of us who have multiple degrees. So, and I understand. I'm like you, Chelsea. I would have probably kept my ideas to myself, but it does have to do with those people who do speak up are having their ideas validated more, which might result in someone like you or someone like me just kind of, stepping back and letting them have the floor. So thank you for sharing that with us. So as we know, awareness, great news, awareness of our biases is the key to working past that. So the more you're aware of the fact of bias, the easier it is to interrupt that. So we've discussed how it can affect our work. Let's talk about next steps. And that's, talking about having the conversation and how it may affect our work. If you notice potentially biased behavior at work, try to push to bring it up. Try to do that in a non-confrontational way. After all, it's not always what you say, but how you say it. Sometimes it may not be appropriate to bring it up in a group setting. You may want to, unless that's the conversation that you're having about biases and things. Otherwise, you may want to address either with a peer or a manager. Sometimes we do have to manage up to have that one-on-one conversation, because they may not even be aware of what it is that they're doing. And for instance, if they always give validation to, for instance, those same 3 people, it makes you or I less likely to contribute to the conversation when we don't receive that same validation, even when what we're saying is correct or relevant to it. And again, just a suggestion on how you can start that conversation. Have you noticed? Or when you say this, the I statements, I feel this particular way. This is just one example as to how you can bring up that conversation. Does anyone have any other suggestions on how you may start that conversation with someone or with a group?
Karen, I was actually going to comment on your have you noticed question, because when someone, for example, if someone were to come at me and say, have you noticed, I feel like it's attacking. So for me, this has actually happened to me recently when you talk about education. And, when people question your background and don't consider your life experience and business experience as equal to or less than or greater than whatever it may be, then their professional degree that they have and a wall full of accolades, it's for me it's like I would rather say that actually makes me feel like you don't respect what I've earned and worked hard for, and then maybe you can say have you noticed that you do that, or something that is less attacking, starting with the I statement instead of the you statement. So just like when you have a conversation with your spouse at home, I feel this way, sharing your feelings about it is going to make them recognize it a little bit better than saying, hey, do you know that you're doing this and you need to stop doing that? So it's in those instances you can do that because it's your spouse, but
I was just say, wait, so I'm not supposed to address that like that?
But sometimes if they don't understand how you feel, they're not going to get it, and because they don't feel that way or they just don't see that other side. So I was going to say, starting with that you comment is a little more attacking to me. Not everybody feels that way, but for me personally, I would rather start with the I comment before I throw it back at them.
I love that, Teresa. So I'll definitely update that, because that does make a difference. Starting with that I statement and then maybe move into the, well, have you noticed when you've done such and such? So yes, being vulnerable, it requires us to be vulnerable, again, in those conversations. Thank you so much. Anyone else? Well, as I promised, here is my reference slide here. Of course, I showed you the picture of the book Blind Spot and the author. These are some other resources that were used to put our presentation together today. So I'm glad this is being recorded. So if you all would like to go back and review any of these resources and of course, pick up this book, I do not get any kickback from that. It's just one that I read often. I don't know if you could see my little tabs as I do with my books, just to help me to refer to some specific points. And as always, I always have a good time. I always learn something from you all when I do these presentations. That's why I say I'd like to say I'm a facilitator as opposed to a teacher. Yes, I have an agenda, but we're all adults and we all bring something to the table. And I love the sharing of knowledge. Anyone have any closing comments or suggestions? You know, we're always open to that. So please, I want to open the mic up.
I just want to say thank you. I really enjoyed today's session just because, and I want to share this video with this person that I recently had a conversation with. Because if somebody is coming at you with that, you know, degreed, you know, what's your background, what's your degree in, it makes you feel less than.
Yeah.
And I don't think people realize how much that it makes someone feel less than. And it's very frustrating. You know, people work hard regardless of what their background is and to get where they are. And if they're a leader of an organization, they didn't just stumble upon it. They worked hard to get there and they earned that position. And so I really appreciate this today because it really hit home for me on a recent conversation.
I think that's awesome. And you're right. Even though, you know, behind me, I have all those frames and things, but I'll be the first person to tell you, those mean nothing. Because you can be, wait, this is a quote from Jane Elliott. And if you're not familiar with who Jane Elliott is, definitely look her up. She said, I know you've been well schooled, but you haven't been well educated. And she's talking about those life experiences. So it means a lot. Again, I talked about my grandfather, third grade education, but one of the smartest men that I knew. And the same with my parents and maybe some of your parents or people in your family. So I totally agree with you, Teresa. So please do share that video. And as you send out the link, would you send it to me as well? Because I have some people I'd like to send it to.
Absolutely.
As well. So if that's it, folks, it is 9:26. Again, I appreciate all the feedback and information. And I think you said this is the next to the last session that you all have with us. We certainly, again, appreciate that. And I want to wish you all a happy rest of your Tuesday and have a great week.
Thank you, Karen. This was fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.